Hey friends. Tonight we unroll a scroll that was never meant to be read. A tale too fragile for the throne, too dangerous for historians. We begin in the shadow of a collapsing empire, where a single name, whispered in the wrong corridor, could reshape all of Europe. Before you drift into sleep, know this. Beneath every marble hall of Constantinople, there were whispers of a child, a secret heir, born not in splendor, but in silence. So turn down the lights. Let the hum of your fan be your sentinel, and allow this forgotten page of history to carry you gently across centuries. Tonight, we walk slowly through a palace that no longer stands, a city that glittered like a lantern between two continents, and a history written in whispers, not ink. You may have heard of Constantinople, where spires pierced the golden sky and the scent of incense clung to every stone. But tonight, we won't stand with the emperors. We won't dine with generals, or watch the Hagia Sophia glow with candlelight. No, we'll slip beneath the opulence, down into a chamber the world forgot, and listen for the breath of a child the empire could never acknowledge, because some heirs are crowned in gold, and others are hidden. So turn down the lights, let the stillness gather like dust around a forgotten throne, and let's drift, together, into the halls of the last Byzantine twilight. The year was 1451, and Constantinople was dying. Not loudly, no, not yet. It was the kind of dying that happens in marble, in faded mosaics, in doors that hadn't been opened in years. An empire once carved across continents now clung to a few fragile miles of city walls, still pretending that the purple robes meant something. Emperor Constantine XI sat on a throne his ancestors would not have recognized. The silk had dulled. The guards wore rust beneath their armor, and the great bronze gates of the city were manned by boys who had never seen war. But deep within the palace beyond, the basilicas and treasure halls, there was a room. No name, no title. It wasn't on any map. Only one servant ever entered. An older woman named Ligeia, who spoke to no one and wore the same gray veil every day. She never bowed to courtiers, never spoke to priests, but every morning, at exactly the 9th hour, she passed the west wing's archway with a small clay bowl, and disappeared behind a tapestry that fluttered ever so slightly, even when the air was still. Behind that tapestry was a door. Behind the door, a hall, and at the end of the hall was a child. No one knew his name. Ligeia called him Alba, which meant dawn. A cruel joke, perhaps naming a child of shadows after the morning. He was not like other children. His eyes were too knowing. His fingers moved as if they remembered things his body hadn't learned. He rarely cried, rarely laughed, but he listened with a stillness so pure it made the candles flicker. No one spoke of him, not even the emperor, especially not the emperor, because Alba was a secret, woven from guilt, politics, and fear. His mother, unknown, his father. The rumors said Constantine himself, though the emperor had never acknowledged a child. But the timing, the features, the haste with which the boy was hidden when he was born, it was enough for the whispers. Enough for Ligeia to be summoned. Enough for one room to be sealed forever except to a single threadbare servant, and the boy she fed with honeyed milk and lullabies that sounded suspiciously like prayers. But what no one knew, not the nobles, not the monks, not even Ligeia, was that Alba was watching each morning after she left. He would climb to the narrow window slit and stare out past the palace roofs, past the sea, and wait for something. Not freedom, not rescue, but memory. He had dreams of fire, of marching feet, of a star falling from the sky and crashing through the dome of the Hagia Sophia. And in the dreams, he always stood alone, silent, as the city burned around him, far across the water. On the shores of Anatolia, another boy stood, but this one was no secret. He was Memder to the Ottoman sultans. 15 years old, and already sharper than the viziers who tried to control him. He, too, watched the sea. But where Alba watched in silence, Memd watched in calculation. Constantinople, the jewel he'd been raised to covet. A city his ancestors had besieged, but never conquered. His tutors told him it was the bastion of Christian blasphemy. His generals told him it was impenetrable, but Mehmed saw a story waiting to be rewritten. He believed in signs, in destiny, and he believed truly that he had been born for one reason only: to break the gates of Constantinople, inside the city. Alba traced the cracks in his wall with soft fingers. He could hear the bells echoing faintly, their notes uneven, like they too were growing tired. He had a book, just one, given to him by Lygia when he was 6. A copy of the Alexiad, by Anna Komnene, the story of emperors, of betrayals, of a daughter who watched the empire with sharp eyes and steady hands. Alba had memorized every line, but tonight, something felt different. The wind had changed. From the narrow window, he could smell smoke not from a fire, but from distant camps. He heard no drums, no horns, but something inside him stirred, a pressure, like the city was holding its breath. That night, Lygia didn't sing. She sat with him, silently, one hand on his shoulder, the other clutching her robe too tightly. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "They are coming," she said, and he, only 9 years old, did not ask who, because he already knew. By spring, the Ottoman army had arrived. 100,000 men, cannon that shook the earth, ships that were dragged across hills to bypass chains in the harbor. Constantinople braced, but inside the sealed room, Alba waited, watched, listened. He saw the first star fall, just like in his dreams. He heard the first blast of cannon echo. Through the stones he felt the dust fall from the ceiling, and did not flinch. On the 7th day, Lygia came to him with tears. "I made a promise," she whispered, "to your mother, that you would never be taken." She held a bundle wrapped in violet cloth. Inside it, a ring, gold, with the imperial eagle. "Your name," she started, then stopped. Instead, she placed the ring in his palm, and kissed his brow. "I only ever wanted to keep you safe," she said. He looked at her, not afraid, not even surprised. And finally he spoke. "I know. On the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, the walls of Constantinople fell. The last emperor, Constantine XI, was said to have died in the breach, sword in hand, stripped of royal garb so he could fall as a soldier. The Ottomans swept through the city. Hagia Sophia was taken, the palace plundered. But when the Janissaries found the west wing and pulled down the tapestry, they found nothing. No door, no hall, no boy. Alba was gone. And so too was the last thread of Byzantium's blood, or so it seemed, because 40 years later, in a dusty monastery in the Carpathian hills, a letter arrived and signed, unsealed, and written in Greek, so ancient that the monks could barely decipher it. It contained no name, no date. Only one phrase: "The eagle sleeps beneath the mountain. When the city is ready, he will return." The monks burned the letter, declared it heresy. But one young novice, who had been sweeping the hall, memorized it, and swore on the bones of saints that the handwriting matched a line he had seen once in an imperial charter from Constantinople: "Sleep now." Friends, we are only at the beginning. There are deeper chambers still, unspoken alliances, and a hidden path from the ashes of an empire to the dreams of a child who may have been more than a secret. He may have been the last heir of Rome. The monks burned the letter, declared it heresy. But one young novice, who had been sweeping the hall, memorized it, and swore on the bones of saints that the handwriting matched a line he had seen once in an imperial charter from Constantinople. He didn't sleep that night. He waited for the bells of matins, then crept back to the old archive room where the manuscripts slumbered, wrapped in mildew and dust. He unrolled the parchment by candlelight. There it was, barely legible, on order scribbled in haste, signed not with a name but a sigil, the double-headed eagle, and beneath it, 3 words in Greek, same as the letter, only now the parchment was dated 1453, the year the city fell. He leaned closer, heart pounding, not from fear, but from understanding. The signature didn't belong to the emperor. It belonged to someone else. Someone still alive when the letter came. Someone who had once been a child behind a sealed door. Someone with a ring wrapped in violet cloth. and eyes that had watched the city burn from a narrow window. Alba, the novice, didn't speak of it. Not to the abbot, not to the brothers. But he began to look for him, quietly. In maps that hadn't been copied in years. In letters passed through merchant routes. In songs sung by travelers who didn't know what they were singing. One ballad, heard at a roadside inn near the old Roman border, spoke of a man in grey robes, who healed the sick, and wrote in a strange dialect of Greek no one had spoken in 100 years. Another tale, from a trader in Thessaloniki, told of a scroll kept in a hidden box, sealed with the double eagle passed from hand to hand by those who still believed in the return of the city. Each thread was too thin to follow, but they formed a pattern, a shadow that moved westward, through villages, across mountains, always just behind the news. Alba had survived by 1468. Whispers reached Florence, not in the halls of politics or the courts of Lorenzo, but in the scriptorio. Monks copied books and stories like veins of ink on parchment. One manuscript arrived with no return mark. It was bound in thin, worn leather. Inside, a translation of Anna Comnen's Alexiad, but with marginal notes. They were delicate, precise, and written by someone who not only knew Anna's world, but felt it. One margin read, "She watched her father's empire crumble by candlelight. I, too, watched mine go cold." The monks thought it a forgery, a poetic flourish. But one scholar, blind in one eye and quiet as folded linen, knew better. The ink was old, not from this region. The script too formal, too precise, was Byzantine. But recent, he made a note, then burned the manuscript, just like the letter before it. Some truths weren't meant to survive in libraries. By 1472, rumors began to change. They no longer spoke of a child, or even a man. They spoke of a teacher, a healer, a gray figure who arrived with the storms, tended to the wounded, and left behind only quiet and questions. In Ragusa, a sailor claimed he saw him speak to the sea, and the waves calmed. In a monastery near Buda, a child claimed he dreamt of a man who wore no crown, but walked like he'd once held empires in his hands. None of it was proof. But for those who still remembered Byzantium, it was enough. Meanwhile, across the Bosphorus, the new city rose. Memde had rebuilt Constantinople. In his image, minarets soared beside domes. The call to prayer echoed where choirs once sang. And yet, beneath the grandeur, a fear lingered, a name that no one dared speak. But that returned again and again in the dreams of dying soldiers, old scribes, and certain women who lit candles in places where no one prayed anymore. They called him the Ash-Heir, because he rose from fire, and walked unseen, because though the city had changed hands, its soul somehow remained hidden, waiting in a village near the edge of the Danube. A child was born with eyes like ancient stone. His mother said he never cried, that he stared at the mountains like he'd seen them fall once. On the day he turned 9, a man in gray came to their door. He didn't speak. He didn't knock. He simply placed a bundle on the stone threshold, a small scroll, a ring of gold, and a copy of the Alexiad. The boy opened the scroll. There were only 2 words, in Greek. "Remember us. Sleep now, friend. The city is quiet, but its shadows move. The empire has fallen, but its heir walks still, not in palaces, not in crowns, but in pages, and songs, and firelight. And somewhere, beneath the mountain, he waits." The boy opened the scroll. There were only 2 words, in Greek. "Remember us." He didn't ask who us was. He didn't need to. The moment his fingers touched the ring, something stirred. Not in the room, not even in the village, but in Memorya, hallway lined with tapestries. A woman with gray veils and kind hands. A city broken, glowing, eternal. He was too young to explain it, but old enough to feel it. The ring didn't just fit, it belonged. The man in gray had already vanished by the time his mother rushed to the door. She searched the hills, asked the neighbors. No one had seen anyone arrive, or leave, only the faint scent of myrrh hung in the cold morning air, and for the first time in years, the mountain above the village, usually quiet, trembled faintly, just once. like something shifting beneath the stone, far to the south. The whispers returned. In the new courts of Istanbul, Constantinople, a scholar presented a scroll. To the Sultan's advisor, it was written in formal Greek, but the style was strange, not modern, not classical, something in between, deliberate, unmistakably royal. The scroll described the architecture of Hagia Sophia, but not as it was now, as it had been, in a voice that remembered. It spoke of secret stairwells, sealed altars, and a crypt said to lie directly beneath the great dome, never consecrated, never mapped. And then, a final line, the last breath of the eagle is not silence, it is memory. The advisor dismissed it as forgery, but he locked the scroll away, and did not burn it, in a cold cell beneath Vienna. A man was brought before an aging noble. The prisoner claimed to be a teacher, but carried no papers, no name, only a ring, gold-etched with a fading eagle. The noble recognized the emblem. He had seen it once as a boy, when his father had shown him a medallion taken from a fleeing Byzantine courier during the fall of Trebizond. "You are too young to remember this," the noble said, and the man answered, "I am not young, only unchanged." The tales grew harder to trace after that. He moved in silence, like smoke through cracks. Like a lullaby you almost remember. In Poland, a physician wrote of a patient who spoke only in High Greek, but whose wounds healed faster than they should have. In Venice, a bookseller found a codex bound in old leather that contained annotations in the margin. Rome fell. Byzantium dimmed, but the fire was never extinguished, only covered. In a remote church in Wallachia, a fresco appeared overnight. It showed a child beneath a dome, watching the city burn, but his eyes, they glowed gold. The local priest claimed no artist had painted it, that the wall had been blank the day before, and that on the morning the image appeared, every candle in the church lit itself. They began calling him the Ash Heir, not as a name, but as a warning, because wherever he went, things stirred. Old vaults unlocked. Scrolls returned to trembling. Hands. Dreams came to the faithful visions of marble cities, of wings spread across the Bosphorus, of bells ringing where there were no towers left. Some feared him, others followed, but none could prove he was real. Only that wherever belief had died, he had walked through the smoke and whispered it back to life. One winter, long after the first letter had turned to ash, the novice Petros, now a silent old monk, sat at his writing desk. He opened a blank parchment, lit a single candle, and wrote, "He still walks. I saw him last spring, near the old Roman road." He did not speak, but he looked at me, and I remembered everything. He sealed the letter, but didn't send it. He simply placed it on the windowsill, and left the shutters open by morning. The letter was gone, and in its place, a gold ring, wrapped in violet cloth. The empire had ended. The walls had fallen. The books had closed. But somewhere, in the quiet places, between breath and belief, a figure still walked. No longer a child, no longer a prince, not emperor, not prophet, not ghost, just memory, wrapped in flesh, carrying a fire that refused to die. And beneath the mountain, where the wind sang like bells in the dark, a doorway remained hidden, waiting. And beneath the mountain, where the wind sang like bells in the dark, a doorway remained hidden, waiting. It was not carved with runes, not sealed with stone, only a hollow, woven in shadow, where torchlight vanished without touching the walls. No map marked it, no traveler recalled it. But still, every few years someone would stumble upon it. A shepherd chasing a lost lamb, a hunter caught in sudden fog, a pilgrim who took one wrong turn and never found his way back. Those who entered never returned, with words only silence, eyes a little wider, hearts a little slower, and in rare cases, dreams that would not leave them alone. They spoke of domes beneath earth, of voices whispering in tongues they didn't know, but somehow understood, of a man in gray, standing beneath crumbling frescoes, reading by candlelight as if time had forgotten him. No one believed them, of course. Villagers shook their heads. Priests crossed themselves. But one merchant, years later, awoke from such a dream and drew a symbol in his ledger's margin. A double-headed eagle, one wing broken. He couldn't explain why, in the ruins of old Mistras, ivy wrapped around marble like memory, refusing to let go. Once a seat of Byzantine learning, it now slept beneath moss and cypress. But in its oldest chamber, beneath what had once been a library, a lantern glowed. A scholar named Makar had made it his home. He had no patron, no students, only dust, parchment, and questions that never seemed to end. He was chasing something. Not fame, not even truth, but a thread. A name that kept appearing, or at Shouldn, single quotes to Alba, in burned margins. In a palimpsest found beneath a hymn in Mount Athos, scratched lightly. He watched the city fall. I was the city. Mc thought it a metaphor. At first, then came the letter. Delivered by a girl with no name and a coin pressed into her palm. Written in Greek, not ancient, not modern, elegant, strange. You look in books, but you forget the city still breathes. Beneath the places where memory sleeps. There was no signature, only a ring-shaped smudge at the bottom. Like something heavy had rested there. Makar packed his things the next morning, in a salt-worn chapel off the coast of Thrace. A bell rang once, then twice, then no more. Inside, an old woman lit candles, on an altar that bore no saints. Just a faded icon, its face scratched away. But its wings intact, she whispered a prayer. Not in Latin, not in Turkish, but in a Greek so old. The walls seemed to recognize it. When she finished, she turned to the shadows near the door. You're late, she said softly. From the darkness, a man stepped forward. He did not bow. He did not speak. But he placed a scroll on the stone beside her. And inside it, folded neatly, was a map, not of the city, but beneath it, passages, wells, chambers, and in the very center, a sigil, a doorway marked only with one word. Alpha Nu, Alpha Mu, Omicron, New Way. Waiting, the city. Now Istanbul no longer remembered his name, but it remembered his silence. Children claimed to see a man standing near the old cisterns, watching the water. Fishermen said he walked the seawalls at night, head bowed, as if listening to something far away. And in the Grand Bazaar, an old rug vendor kept a coin in his pocket, worn smooth, with an eagle's wing barely visible. He said he'd been paid with it once, by a customer who disappeared the moment the sale was done. Didn't speak, the vendor would mutter. But when he looked at you, it felt like you were being remembered. Elsewhere, in the libraries of Cairo, a fragment of parchment was uncovered, sealed in a hidden compartment within the spine of a crusader's Bible. The ink was faded, but legible. It contained no history, no dates, only a story of a boy in a palace, of a woman in gray, of a ring passed down through silence, generation to generation. The final lines were the strangest. He carries no army, he writes no law, but, where he walks, the ruins lean toward him. The scholar who found it laughed. Poetry, she said. But she kept it. Tucked in her sleeve, next to her pulse. She read it every night before sleep. And sometimes, in dreams, she saw the dome of Hagia Sophia before it fell, and a boy just watching, in the mountains of Bulgaria. A firekeeper told a story to travelers seeking warmth. He called it the Prince of No Throne. Said the prince had once walked through his village, many years ago. He had no crown, no name. But every dog grew silent, and the birds, even in winter, followed him for miles. He said the prince stayed one night in the firekeeper's hut, didn't eat, didn't sleep, but asked for ink and parchment. Wrote only 5 words. The empire is not gone. Then vanished. At dawn in Venice, a child born mute suddenly spoke during Mass. He looked up at the painted ceiling, pointed, and said, "He is under the mountain." The priests dismissed it. Said the child was touched by something diviner, perhaps by madness. But the painter of that ceiling, who had included a tiny hidden symbol in the fresco, a ring, wrapped in violet cloth, went pale. He had never told anyone about that detail. Had painted it from a dream that wouldn't let go. One he'd had every year on the same night, May 29th, the day Constantinople fell, and in a forgotten cave beneath the stone roots of Thrace, a door opened, not with a creak, not with a sound, just a breath. and behind it, a man walked once more into the world. He no longer wore gray, he wore black, the color of ink, of shadow, of memory that refused to fade. In his hand, the ring, not worn, but held, as if it had become too heavy with time, too full of names he could no longer forget. He looked to the horizon, then stepped forward. The city did not see him, not yet, but somewhere, a candle relit itself. A bell rang in a chapel no one had entered, and far away, beneath a scholar's bed in Mistras, the map began to smolder around the edges, its ink fading, but in the center, the word remained, Alpha Nu Alpha Mu, Omicron Nu Way, still waiting. He looked to the horizon, then stepped forward. The earth did not tremble, no trumpets sounded, but far beneath the city that had forgotten him, something ancient opened its eyes, not with fear, not with joy, but with recognition. He had no name now, not one he used. The names had come, and Ganalba, Andreas, Ionzich, whispered like a secret into the folds of time, then folded again. But one name had stayed, carried in dreams, in ruins, in the creases of songs sung in silence, Heir, not because he rose from fire, but because he never left it. He moved through cities like a breeze through curtains, noticed only when the light changed, spoken of only when the silence lingered too long in Ragusa. A child drew a figure in the frost of a window to wings, one bent. Her father said it was nothing. But that night, he dreamed of bells ringing in a dome that no longer stood. In Rhodes, a dying monk whispered, "He still writes." No one knew what he meant. But when they opened his cell, they found parchment, dozens of pages written in a script so precise, it looked printed. The language was Greek, but older, more exact, almost royal. At the bottom of each page, a mark, a ring pressed into wax. The seal of the double-headed eagle. One wing, broken. He did not sleep in beds. He did not stay in inns. He walked the thresholds, monasteries, caves, bold battlements, places with walls old enough to remember. His ring stayed wrapped in violet cloth. It was no longer worn. It had become too loud. Every time it touched skin, memories bloomed. A woman screaming in a tower. A child, hidden behind a curtain of blue silk. Hands gripping stone as the gates collapsed. He had carried those moments for so long, they no longer stung. But they whispered, and memory, like water, always seeks its level. In a monastery near the old Thracian border, a novice uncovered a hidden drawer behind an altar. Inside, a small copper plate, etched with words no one had written in centuries. He walks not to rule. He walks because the city still calls. No one knew what it meant. But the abbot wept when he saw the script. It was his grandmother's handwriting, and she had died 40 years before the novice was born, in Florence. The Medici archives recorded a letter that never reached its sender. It read, "We have seen him, not clearly, but enough to know he is no myth. He moves like time forgotten. He speaks in the tone of ruined things, and yet he is not ruined. He is remembering." The letter was unsigned, but the courier who carried it swore he met no one, only found it beneath his saddle, wrapped in violet silk. He never returned to Florence. He became a monk, and built a small chapel without icons, only a single symbol carved above the door, a bird with two heads, each facing opposite ends of a crumbling road. The ash air reached the Black Sea by midsummer. The sky was thick with gulls. The water shone like broken steel. He sat on the shore for 3 days, said nothing. But the tide changed. Fishermen whispered that the wind reversed, bringing in fish that hadn't swum near those waters in decades. One old man left bread and oil on a stone nearby. He found it gone the next morning, and in its place, a drawing carved into the rock with a fingertip. A city, with 7 domes, and 1 open gate. The old man told no one for years, until the day his granddaughter was born. She had gray eyes, and a birthmark shaped like a crown. He did not write much, but when he did, the ink never faded. In Transylvania, a small library held a codex too old for its region. When opened, it wept dust. Inside, diagrams of Constantinople, but not as it had been known new streets, new bridges, a plan, a restoration, written by a hand that trembled only slightly, as if its bones remembered marble, even as the world crumbled around them. The final line read, "To rebuild is not to return. It is to remember forward." Some said he was gathering followers. Others, that he avoided them. The truth was quieter. He met those who needed him. Only once, and never twice. A blind scribe in Serbia said a man had placed his hands on her shoulders, and suddenly she could recite verses from the Gospels in Koine Greek, though she had never learned it. A dying prince in Bohemia claimed a stranger held his hand for hours, and in that time, he relived not his own life, but the final moments of the last emperor. He died with tears on his cheeks, and a smile. A historian in Alexandria wrote of a recurring figure in old myths, a man who always arrived after the fall. Sometimes he healed, sometimes he wept, sometimes he simply listened, but in every story, he carried a ring, and behind him, cities whispered their names to the wind, in the shadow of Mount Athos. A church bell rang 13 times. No one pulled the rope. When the monks rushed outside, they saw a scroll pinned to the door by a nail of bone. It contained only a list, names, dates, coordinates, at the bottom, a signature they could not translate. But the ink shimmered when touched, and smelled faintly of salt and myrrh. Some said he was looking for something. Others believed he was hiding, but perhaps he was both. The weight of a lost empire is not measured in stones or thrones. It is carried in silence, in footsteps that echo where no one walks, in languages spoken only to ghosts. He did not seek to reclaim Byzantium. He was Byzantium, not in title, but in remembering, in the careful way he laid stones on mountain paths that others might one day follow, in the gentle turning of pages older than nations, in the way he lit candles where churches no longer stood. He stood once at the edge of the Bosphorus, watching the city that had forgotten its name. Domes now bore crescent moons. Markets bustled in languages his ancestors had never spoken. But the wind was the same, and in the distance, he heard a bell. Just one, a sound so faint, it could have been a memory dot or a promise. That night he returned to the cave, the violet cloth, unfolded the ring, placed in the center of a circle of ash. He did not speak, but if one had stood near, they might have heard the faintest breath escape his lips. Not a prayer, not a name, just a single word. In Greek, sigma y, nu tau, omicron, mu alpha, soon. He did not rise at once. The cave was still. The wind beyond the threshold held its breath, as if the mountain itself was waiting to be spoken to again. A single candle flickered. Its flame moved like a dancer listening to a song only it could. Here, around it, the ash ring smoldered not with fire, but with memory, each ember curled with the echo of names, long sealed in tombs. No one tended any more. But he remembered. He always remembered. Not as a burden, but as a duty wrapped in silence. His fingers hovered over the ring. He did not touch it, not yet miles away, in Thessaloniki. A boy awoke from a fever dream with salt on his lips. He had never seen the sea yet. In his sleep, he had walked marble corridors, draped in banners too faded to name, with light pouring through colored glass that no longer existed. He told his mother. She wept not from fear, from recognition. She too had dreamed it, years ago. When she was his age, she had never told anyone, until now, at the edge of the old world, in the forgotten remains of Theodosius' wall, a raven landed on a cracked tower stone and cawed once, then twice. Below, in the weeds, a sigil, pulsed faint like breath, through limestone. It was the emblem of the empire, not as it had been taught, but as it had been before the last gates fell, before the veil of fire, before silence. He walked again, not in haste, not in fear. Each step was deliberate, as though the earth had to remember the shape of his footfall. In towns where no one spoke his language, doors opened, not out of hospitality, out of instinct. Children watched him with eyes that blinked slower. Dogs followed without barking, and bells, if they existed, chimed a half-note too late, after he passed, in Sofia. An archivist unlocked a room sealed since 1814. No one knew. why it had been locked, only that the key had recently arrived in cloth, with no note inside the room, a desk, an hourglass, and a single bound volume, titled only in gold, Lambda Way, Theta, Italethea, the River of Forgetting. The book was blank, but each night, new ink appeared, not written, but pressed into the pages, as though breathed there. The archivist stopped speaking after the 7th page appeared. He spent the rest of his days translating what came, never showing the texts, only whispering a single phrase before he died. He walks the seams of time, where cities forget they once were kings. Some said he had been seen crossing the Danube barefoot, though the ice had not yet melted. Others claimed he stood outside an ossuary in Prague, counting the skulls, as if looking for one in particular. He left no tracks, but where he passed, the air seemed cleaner. The light bent softer, and in forgotten churches, cobwebs fell from icons without touch. In Mount Ararat's shadow, a nun kept vigil for 3 nights. On the 3rd, a figure entered the chapel. She did not see him, but her oil lamp flared, and every flower on the altar opened, though it was deep winter. He left behind no offering, only a whisper in her ear as she slept, one she later painted on the chapel wall in crimson and gold. The flame is not the end of the candle, it is the memory of the wick. The man once called Heir never traveled by map. He walked where the world cracked, where borders had bled, where statues had lost their faces, where stones cried out beneath the weight of being forgotten. He traced these scars, not to erase them, but to remind them they were wounds once kissed by greatness. In a silent room of the Vatican archives, a letter surfaced. It bore no date, no sender. Its paper was older than anything nearby, but it had not yellowed. The script inside was Byzantine, royal, and yet the words were not written as command, but as testimony. We did not lose, we paused. The empire folds, but it does not die. It walks, in ash, in memory, in me. The letter was stored in the section for Apocrypha, but the archivist who catalogued it began dreaming in Greek. He had never learned Greek. Once. On the Isle of Chios, a girl saw him at twilight. She had wandered too far from the village. Drawn by a melody no one else heard, he stood at the edge of the cliff, his back to her, watching the sea. When she called out, he did not turn, but the wind shifted, and she heard him sing, no words. Just a tone. It sounded like morning, but also like hope, carried across centuries like incense in a cracked censer. She ran home. Years later, she composed a symphony titled simply Ember. No one could play its final movement. The notes made the strings tremble. The dome of Hagia Sophia remained silent. But once, in the early hours of an unmarked day, a janitor sweeping near the mihrab found a gold thread coiled beneath the stone. He picked it up. It vanished. When he looked back at the wall, he saw something beneath the paint. Not a new shape. An old one, bleeding through. An eagle. 2 heads. One eye closed. In an alley in Alexandria, an old woman read fortunes from sand. She said nothing when the man approached. Just poured the sand slowly. Watched it form a shape. Then looked up, eyes wide. "You are the dream they sealed," she whispered. "You are the crack they cannot patch." He said nothing, only nodded. She wept, not from fear, from gratitude. No stories claimed he ate. No records said he bled. But all agreed he remembered. Not in the way of scholars. In the way of ruins that refused to fall. He was not legend. He was ledgered at every step, a line. Every silence, a name. He did not march. He did not flee. He moved like a shadow of flame, not fire, but the glow left behind unclosed eyes. Beneath a ruined aqueduct near Ankara, he found what he had not spoken of in years. A vault, sealed in the shape of a star. Its lock was not a mechanism. It was a memory. He pressed the ring still, wrapped in violet against the stone. The air changed. The wind bowed. The stones exhaled, and the star turned. The vault opened, inside a throne of cedar, cracked, unoccupied, and beside it, a scroll, still breathing with ink. He did not read it. He closed the vault again, and whispered, "Not yet." He left no monuments, only murmurs. But in the cracked spaces of Europe, the silence began to change. Walls wept fresh salt. Domes echoed footsteps when no one walked, and bells rang in cities where no clappers remained. One day, they said, the ring would be worn again, not to rule, but to remind, not to rebuild, but to rekindle, not to return, but to walk through ash and make memory rise like breath before dawn. And somewhere, even now, he walks. ... Not yet. The word echoed like breath. Trapped in stone, he did not linger. He never did. The vault closed behind him without sound. No click, no grind of ancient gears. Just absence, as though it had never opened. As though he had never stood there. But the earth knew. It remembered the warmth of his step. The way his shadow curved with memory. The hush of something older than time sitting once more where it belonged. He walked north, past fields once soaked in siege blood, past bones smoothed by centuries, past cities that had renamed themselves too many times to remember the first. The river was wide and cold. He crossed it barefoot, not out of ritual, because it would not let him pass any other way. Each step on the water's edge felt like a question asked by the mud itself. Are you the one? He did not answer. But the reeds bent. In Budapest, an old man painted murals no one commissioned. On the side of a crumbling theater, a golden dome. On the back of a bakery, a double-headed eagle with eyes closed. He had never seen these symbols, had never been taught the past, but when asked, he only said, I paint what the stones whisper. One morning he vanished, left behind only a brush. Dipped in violet, he reached the Carpathians with lungs full of pine and silence. The mountains did not know him, but they did not refuse him. That night, in the crook of two sleeping ridges, he made a fire from cedar and old scrolls, not ones of scripture, ones of record, ink that had long dried, names that had been buried under layers of rebranding. He burned them not in anger. In reverence, he whispered each name, as flame kissed it not aloud, but in breath. Far south, beneath what had once been Mistra, a woman uncovered a tiled floor under a vineyard. It depicted a map, not of lands, of stories, each tile etched with scenes. A child by a broken gate, a cloaked man placing candles along a wall, a ring resting in a bowl of ash. She called no scholars. She sealed the room. She said it was not for now, just for when, in Krakow. A scholar translated a letter that made no sense, written in 3 scripts, Latin, and something older. Something that pulsed faintly when touched. The letter began with a greeting to a city that no longer stood. It ended with a warning. When the bells toll without hands, when the wind writes names into snow, he is near. The next morning, the bells rang. There was no wind, only stillness. And across the frost on his window pane, a name appeared. His own. He did not age. At least, not like others. His hair grayed, his back bent with a quiet grace. But his eyes never lost their weight. They carried centuries in their corners, like libraries that had burned but remembered the stories. In small villages, children watched him with the solemnity of old saints. One girl asked if he was a ghost. He smiled once, only once, and said, No, I am what the ghosts remember. He returned to a monastery once buried in snow. The monks did not recognize him, but the gate opened. Rust fell like rain from its hinges. Inside, he found the room where he had once been hidden. A crib still stood, carved with the initials, Alpha Pi. He sat beside it, silent for hours, then placed a small object beneath the pillow. A toy, worn smooth by time, in Rome. The fountains slowed. Water moved, not with force, but with caution. A priest dreamt of a city beneath the sea. Columns breathing, statues waiting. He awoke with water in his ears, and a name on his lips, a name not spoken aloud since 1453. He told no one. He simply lit a candle, and did not extinguish it for 30 days. The ash air, though no one called him that aloud any more, reached Vienna. In midwinter, snow fell like ash. The Danube froze in half steps, as though unsure how to carry such weight. Across its back, he stood before the old palace gates, once the seat of the Habsburgs. Once the pride of a lineage bent inward, he placed one hand on the iron, whispered a name, not his, but hers. Joanna. The gates did not open, but behind them a bell rang, soft, like memory waking. In an attic above the Bosphorus, a cartographer found a scroll in a drawer that hadn't opened in decades. The scroll contained a map, but not of land, of breath, paths walked by someone unnamed, but traced in dust that shimmered violet when touched by firelight. He copied the paths, tried to walk them. He vanished after the third turn, left behind only the scroll and a journal entry. He does not walk roads. He creates them. In Sarajevo, an old woman sang a song no one knew, a lullaby in a dialect lost before the fall of the Second Rome. She sang it only once, to a man who listened with his eyes closed, who wept when she reached the third verse. He left behind a coin, too old to spend, too valuable to sell. It bore no denomination, only an image, a city, cradled by wings. He slept once, under stars that had seen the world spin too many times, and in his dream, he stood once more in the throne room, not as emperor, as a child, running beneath columns, hiding in curtains of purple, listening to the sounds of prayer and plotting. He turned, saw his mother. She smiled, offered a ring. He woke with tears dried on his cheeks. The ring was in his hand, no longer wrapped in violet. He walked toward the sea. The waters shimmered, not with moonlight, with memory. He stepped in. The waves did not resist, and as he walked, the city behind him stirred. Domes flickered, minarets exhaled, walls remembered, and deep beneath Hagia Sophia, in a chamber no longer known to man, a candle lit itself. Its flame did not dance. It bowed, and somewhere far away, a boy was born with eyes the color of ash, and a birthmark shaped like a gate. He did not return to land for 3 days. The sea did not pull him under. It held him, cradled him, as if it too remembered the boy, born beneath stars cursed to vanish. Each wave whispered a name, each current carried the scent of cedar and myrrh. And when he stepped ashore again, his footprints steamed against the cold stone. Not because he was divine, because he had crossed something most men forgot existed. A place between memory and myth, between empire and ember. A shoreline that should not have been there had made itself known. Just for him, in an old chapel near Ravenna, a fresco flaked, a way to reveal something beneath. Not Roman, not early Christian, but something older. A figure seated on a throne of stone, crowned not with gold, but with ash. The figure's face was incomplete, not unfinished, erased. The artist who uncovered it died the next day. His final sketch left pinned to a candle holder, a hand open, palm up, cracked with time, still waiting. In a Dorn, in a market no one mapped, a merchant sold nothing. He sat beneath a canopy of violet cloth, offering silence to those who stopped. Only one man accepted. He did not speak. He sat. The merchant nodded, reached beneath the cloth, placed a bowl between them inside. A shard of glass curved, blackened, a remnant of something shattered long ago. The man took it, held it up to the sun. It did not reflect light. It absorbed it, and the shadows behind him shifted, as if remembering who they once followed, in Delphi. The wind returned. After decades of stillness, it swept through the stones like a forgotten hymn, knocking dust from statues that had no names left. One old priest, who had guarded ruins no tourists visited, fell to his knees. He had waited 40 years. He did not know for what. Now he did. From beneath the oracle's seat, a whisper rose, not a prophecy, a memory. The city beneath the veil remembers. He moved east, past mountains carved by grief, past streams that wept salt instead of water, past towns that did not appear on maps, but had doors that opened when he approached. The dogs barked once, then wind, then lay flat. Children did not speak to him. They watched, eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition. They would draw him later, in chalk, on stones. Figures cloaked in stormlight, surrounded by keys. Not one key, many, because he was not unlocking, he was reminding God in Jerusalem. A candle in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, cracked, not extinguished, split, Its flame continued to burn, but its base formed a violet fracture. Priests debated its meaning. One old nun wept silently. She had seen the same split in a ring held by her grandmother in the year the walls of her village fell. She whispered the old word, one never taught to her, autocrator. And for a moment, every flame in the church bowed. In the Balkans, a village blacksmith forged nothing for 3 weeks. He had never stopped before. He sat instead, listening to the forge, not the fire. The breathing, it was not in his head, it was memory, hammered into the anvil by ancestors who had once marched with banners, now called myth. On the 22nd day, he rose, forged one item, a seal dot. It bore no crest, only a circle within a circle. The mark of the one who walks, not reigns. He placed it on his door, vanished the next morning. He reached Ani, the city of 1,000 churches. Now silent stone arches collapsed under their own memory. Icons eroded by sun, not sacrilege. He walked through its empty spine, the wind curling around him like forgotten incense. He stood in the cathedral, looked up at the hollow dome, raised his hands, not in prayer, in greeting, and from deep beneath the foundation, a sound emerged, not thunder, not song, drums, distant, faint, steady, the same rhythm carved into the border of his dreams since childhood. In Istanbul, a young girl found a key buried in her courtyard. It was warm, though the soil had been frozen. She showed her grandfather. He turned pale, took her to a locked room. Inside, maps, manuscripts, portraits of emperors with eyes that looked too much like her own. The key matched none of the locks, until she placed it in a box her grandfather said had never opened. It clicked. Inside, a ring, wrapped in violet cloth. Her grandfather wept, but not out of fear, out of knowledge. He whispered, "He is drawing near, the blood remembers." On Mount Athos, monks heard chanting in an empty chapel, low-layered, male voices speaking in Old Greek, Armenian, and a language none could identify. The next morning, a manuscript appeared on the altar. No ink, no paper, carved into cedar, with a blade no man recalled owning. The text described a path, not geographic, spiritual, a series of rites forgotten after the sack of Trebizond. The abbot read the final line aloud, and in the candlelight, his breath turned to smoke. Though the air was warm, he did not announce himself. He never had. He walked into a garden in the heart of Thessaloniki. It had once been imperial. Now it fed no one, tended by no hands, but the vines were thick, and the figs were sweet. He sat beneath a tree, placed the black glass shard on the soil, the ring beside it, and from the branches a bird descended, not flying, gliding. It perched on his shoulder, did not sing, only stared, its eyes white as chalk. He whispered to it, and it flew, carrying nothing, only direction. To where the vault would open again. This time, not to memory, to fire. The garden did not wilt after he left. That was the first sign. Even in winter, the vines remained full, the fruit clung stubbornly, and the soil stayed warm under the frost. Local children dared one another to pluck a fig, but none crossed the threshold. Something in their bones warned them. This was not a place for games. Something had sat there too long, something that had once ruled over marble and thunder, and now whispered in roots and wind. The woman who swept a nearby path told no one. But each morning, she found 3 footprints, not 2 in the snow outside the gate. They never strayed. They never faded. And they were never in the same place twice. In a monastery, high above Mount Cyprus, an old bell rang once, then stopped. No one had touched it. No rope had moved. The brothers gathered, confused. The bell hadn't rung in 57 years, not since the archbishop's funeral. They searched for signs of wind, of movement, of mischief. But the air was still, and their hearts too heavy to invent stories. Only the youngest monk said quietly that the bell had not rung for the dead. It had rung for the living, in the corner of the chapel. Behind the altar, the stone tiles had shifted. Revealed beneath them was a single object, a book, bound in hide. No title, no author. But its pages glowed faintly when turned. He walked beneath the mountains, following paths no longer drawn. In Cappadocia, he did not stay in inns. He slept in caves carved by hands now dust, beside walls painted with icons faded into bone-colored ghosts. Each chamber held echoes, not voices half-remembered prayers. Laughter that had not been heard in 10 lifetimes. Footsteps that matched his own. When he passed through them, the air would warm for a moment, then go still, as if it had recognized something, as if it remembered him. He left no offerings. He did not pray. But each time he left a cave, something behind him whispered, "He is walking back through the past." In the heart of Thessaly, a shepherd found a coin lodged in the skull of a long-dead lamb. Not a Roman coin. Not Byzantine, older stamped, not with a god or emperor, but with a city skyline, domes and columns drawn in impossible precision. Around the edges, words written in a language no living person could read, and no dead one could explain. He carried it to the village priest. The priest wept when he touched it. He dreamed of that coin as a child held it in his sleep, seen it buried in a ring of fire. They said no more. They wrapped the coin in cloth and placed it under the altar. The lamb's skull was reburied, facing east, in Smyrna. A woman painted a mural on the wall of an abandoned bathhouse. She had never painted before. She worked only at night. No one saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. Each morning, the mural stretched wider. First a ship, then a city rising from the sea, then a figure standing at its gates, cloaked in violet, holding a black shard in one hand, and a candle in the other. When it was done, she left behind her brush, and a single word, scrawled beneath the painted man's feet, "Return." He crossed through Anatolia in silence. He did not speak, but the world around him answered. A sparrow followed him for 3 days. A fox trailed him for 6. When he reached the shores of the Black Sea, the water parted not physically, not with spectacle but in rhythm. The tide slowed. The wind stopped. The gulls vanished. He stood at the edge until night fell, then stepped forward not into the water, but onto the sand. Buried just beneath it was a tile, scorched and etched with an eagle's wing. He touched it, not with his hand, but with memory. The seaside. The wind resumed. He turned away in Bithynia. An earthquake struck without tremor. The people didn't feel it, but the soil did. Foundations shifted by an inch. Statues rotated without toppling. And beneath an old fortress wall, a crypt opened. Inside, nothing but a robe, purple, lined with gold thread, perfectly preserved. Resting atop it, a note, written in charcoal. Faded, but legible. When the air walks in shadow, clothe him in history. They closed the crypt, but the robe had vanished by morning. In the cathedral ruins of Nicomedia, 4 candles lit themselves. No flame, just glow. A wandering traveler saw them, approached with hesitation, then reverence. Each candle pulsed with color: violet, gold, ash gray, and deep blue. He touched none of them, but he did kneel, and whispered a name not spoken since the 4th Crusade. The candles did not flicker. They bowed. He reached the forgotten fortress of Cordial, under moonless sky. It stood only as rubble now, moss choking its bones, vines reclaiming each step. But as he walked through it, stone lifted, arches straightened, columns exhaled, not rebuilt, remembered. He entered the chapel. Its ceiling collapsed, its icons scoured. But on the wall, behind the altar, a single symbol remained. A circle within a circle. He traced it with his finger, and for the first time in centuries, the altar groaned, shifted, opened. Beneath it, a staircase. He descended for hours. No torch, no need. The walls glowed faintly, pulsing with old breath. Each step carved with names, some familiar, some erased. Each one a story that ended in silence. At the bottom, a chamber, circular at its center. A stone basin, filled with water that did not ripple. Beside it, a figure, hooded, still ancient, without being aged. It did not look up when he entered, but it spoke. You walk in the echo of yourself. He approached, placed the shard of glass into the basin. It sank. The water turned black. The figure raised its head, eyes of smoke. Then you are ready. In Constantinople no longer called that, but still feeling it for pigeons landed on the roof of the Hagia Sophia. Each had a mark on its wing, a violet stripe. They cooed once, then vanished. A boy sweeping steps below looked up, felt a shiver, not of cold, of familiarity. He went home and drew what he saw. But what appeared on his paper was not for pigeons. It was a man cloaked, stepping through fire, with a crown not on his head, but in his hand. He showed no one, but that night he dreamed of domes and bells ringing without sound. The ash heir, though the name had been buried, climbed the staircase from the basin chamber in silence. The figure had given him no command, only presence. He emerged on a hill overlooking the city once called Queen of the World, the city that had crowned emperors, burned prophets, and swallowed time. He looked upon it not as a conqueror, as a memory, and in his pocket the ring pulsed once. The wind whispered 3 syllables. Kata. He did not respond. He stepped forward, and the city waited. He did not descend from the hill. The city rose to meet him. The wind did not howl, it folded. The sky dimmed, not from cloud, but from memory gathering. Domes shifted under moonlight. Minarets breathed, and the water around the golden horn rippled. Without wind, he walked with no escort, no crown, no army behind him. But the shadows bowed, and the crows on the spires turned their heads to watch. Each step he took felt older than the stone beneath him, as if the ground itself had long waited for the weight of this return. In a courtyard once paved in mosaic, now littered with weeds, and the soft hiss of quiet traffic, a tree bloomed. It should not have. Its roots were cracked, its limbs broken. It had not flowered in 4 lifetimes, but as he passed, the branches turned inward, forming an arch. 5 petals fell in his path. He did not look up, but the petals caught fire as they touched his heels. They did not burn away. They followed a girl in Galata, painted in her sleep. Each night, her parents found her seated at her desk, brush in hand, eyes closed, coating canvas after canvas with images she could not explain. She spoke little by day. Only once, as she wiped violet paint from her fingers, did she say a name, not her own, not her family's, but one no one had taught her. Basileus. Her parents thought it a dream. But the next night, she painted a dome, shining, whole, untouched by time, and on its peak sat not a cross, not a crescent, but a flame. He moved through alleys that twisted like veins, past street signs in languages newer than the stone they were bolted to. Old men watched from doorways. They did not nod, they did not wave, but some pressed their hands to their chests, as if remembering a pledge they had never sworn aloud. Cats followed him, not in curiosity, but in formation, at each corner. They broke off, sitting silent, sentry-eyed, by the time he reached the old cistern. 13 waited around its mouth. When he descended the steps, they did not move. They did not need to. Their eyes remained fixed on the water beneath. The chamber echoed with time. Pillars thick with moss leaned at reverent angles. Water barely stirred across its mirrored floor, and beneath it, statues waited, eyes closed, hands clasped. Carved before Rome had even drawn its first breath. He knelt at the edge, removed the ring from his pocket. It pulsed once, then stilled. He placed it into the water, not with a splash, but with the weight of centuries. The surface did not ripple. Instead, it turned black, then gold, then violet, and across the far wall, a sigil appeared, a circle. Within a circle, it glowed, not with light, with remembrance, in an archive buried beneath the university library. A historian opened a scroll, labeled undated, fragmentary. She had passed it by for years. Today, her hands trembled as she touched it. The ink had faded, the script untranslatable, but as she unrolled it, each line burned faintly, not with fire, with pattern. It depicted a ritual, not of worship, of return. She traced the lines, felt her fingertips go cold. At the bottom, one line had been etched in a language she did not recognize, but could speak aloud. She whispered it, and the lights above her flickered, then dimmed. He rose from the cistern chamber. The ring was no longer in his pocket, but its presence had not left. It pulsed through the soles of his feet, through the breath in his lungs, through the quiet sigh in the wind as he crossed into fatigue. He paused outside a bakery. It had stood for 80 years. Its owner, a woman in her 90s, stepped outside before he could knock. She did not ask his name. She handed him a loaf of bread, round, warm, wrapped in violet cloth. "Long enough," she said. He nodded and kept walking. In a chapel built upon a mosque, built upon a temple. An icon blinked. It was small, barely a hand's width. It showed a boy wrapped in robes too large for him, seated on a stone throne with no legs. The boy's face had always been blank, but tonight, as candles flickered, two eyes formed, one gray, one violet. A priest gasped. He ran to fetch another. When they returned, the icon was blank once more, but the priest's robe now bore ash at the hem. They could not scrub it away. He walked through arches that remembered siege, columns cracked by cannon, walls once white with marble, now pocked and soot-stained. Tourists wandered past, oblivious, phones out, maps glowing. None looked at him, not directly, but one child turned, stared, pointed and said to her father, "Papa, that man isn't from now." Her father laughed, but the girl did not. She watched until he was gone, and drew his face in her notebook that night, perfectly, though she had only seen him for a moment. He reached the gates, not the outer walls, the ones beneath, the buried ones. The gates made of stone and gold and silence. They had not opened in 570 years, but they knew him as he approached. The carvings on their surface lit, not like flame, like breath returning to a mouth. Long closed, the hinges groaned, the air shifted. Dust fell like snow, and the gates opened, not to a room, to a chamber of light. It was not heaven, it was memory. Walls carved with the faces of emperors, ceilings painted with maps of empires erased. A throne stood in the center, stone, unadorned, crowned with nothing. He did not sit. He placed the bread upon it, then the shard of black glass, then a coin, one minted long before Constantine, etched with a flame. Then he stood back, closed his eyes, and whispered, "You are not gone." The chamber answered, "We never were." In a coastal village once part of Thrace, a fisherman woke from a dream. He had seen a crown sink into the ocean, then rise again clean whole, and wrapped in violet cloth. He went to his boat. Without knowing why, he cast his net and pulled up. Nothing except a ring, old, smooth, carved with a symbol. He had only seen once on a fresco long lost to fire. He wrapped it in cloth, placed it beside his bed, and every night thereafter he dreamed of domes returning. He stepped back from the throne. The chamber began to hum. The walls flickered, not with magic, with recognition. Names surfaced from the stone, not just emperors, mothers, scholars, children lost in sieges, soldiers who had held gates alone. They spoke not aloud, but in pulse, and the city above shuddered in the grand bazaar. A lamp lit itself. An old vendor looked up, smiled, then packed his things. He left the lamp behind. When asked why, he said, "He has returned, and light remembers." He climbed the final stairs to the dome. It had been centuries since a sovereign stood here. He looked out over the city, not as a conqueror, not as a king, as a witness. The Bosphorus shimmered. The minarets wept gold, and from the sky, clouds parted not for sun, but for silence. A silence that said, "We remember you. We have always remembered you." He placed the violet cloth at the edge of the balcony, let it unfurl, and beneath it, the ring glowed. The city did not erupt, it sighed. A collective breath held too long, old cracks healed by knowing, old names whispered by wind, domes resonating not with song, but with memory. The heir had not come to rule, he had come to remind, and the city, at last, listened. He remained still for a long time. The violet cloth, curled at his feet, fluttered once in the breeze, then settled. No birds passed overhead. No sounds from the street reached the balcony. Only the weightless hush of a city remembering itself. His eyes were fixed on the sea, not the waves, not the ships, but the horizon, the place where all stories vanish, and only echoes return. He did not speak, but the stone beneath him knew. The walls behind him leaned closer, and from the high dome above, a single line of dust fell, not shaken loose by tremor, but drawn downward by time's release. In the alley where he'd first arrived, the tree finally shed its last leaf. It did not fall. It turned to ash before it touched the ground. The cats scattered, not in fear, in reverence. They had followed him not for protection, but because they remembered something older than meat or warmth. The man was not a king. He was the sigh before, an ending in the grand bazaar. No one noticed the lights dim. Only the old vendor, who had once sold lamps, paused. He took a deep breath. Then he lit a candle, not for profit, for remembrance, outside. Pigeons circled the minarets once, twice, then flew east toward the rising dark. Below the earth, in the cistern chamber, the water stilled. No ripples, no light. The ring was gone. The flame had passed, but a shape remained in the stone. 2 feet, facing the throne, as if someone had waited there for a very long time, and would wait again. He turned from the edge of the balcony, walked back through the dome, past the shattered marble, descended the stairs that had once echoed with prayers in Latin, Greek, Arabic. He did not hesitate. He did not look back, not because he did not feel, but because he remembered too much. In the chamber where the ring had first burned, the candles went out, one by one, not from wind, but from peace. A monk sleeping in his cell stirred, dreamed of domes, floating over oceans of coins tossed into black water, of names whispered with hands, over hearts. And he smiled. He crossed the courtyard of the Hagia Sophia, in silence. The tour groups had gone. The guards had not noticed him. The shadows had parted for him, then closed behind. On the outer gate, a single symbol had been drawn, ash traced across the iron, a circle within a circle. It would vanish by morning, but those who saw it would not forget. He walked the narrow lanes of ballot, past painted doors, shuttered windows, children's chalk on stone. One old woman sitting on her stoop squinted. "You've been here before," she said. He paused. She smiled. "Not in this life, but I've seen that walk." She pointed to the ground. "The last time, you didn't come back." He bowed slightly, and kept moving. Down by the water's edge, the fog thickened. The Bosphorus exhaled mist, as if tired from holding so many centuries. Afloat he stood at the edge of the pier, looked across to where the city had once been, another Byzantium. Nova Roma, Carigrad. Names changed, but breath did not. He stepped onto the boat. There was no oarsman, no sail, just a wooden bench. In silence, he sat. The boat moved. The sky darkened, not with cloud, but with hush-dot lights. In the city, dimmed not all at once, but like waves, drawing back before they crash. One by one, people paused in their homes. Some looked out windows. Some stood in silence. Some wept without knowing why. And one by one, they whispered words they had forgotten. Imperator, Domini, son of the flame, keeper of ash. In the girl's notebook in Galata, a page turned on its own. She had not drawn that image. A man in violet, a ring raised to the sky. Below him, the sea, burning gold. She placed her hand over it, and dreamed no more. The boat crossed the channel slowly. No oars, no wake, only the city behind it breathing out. And before him, the shore opened like an old wound. Finally healed, he stepped ashore. No crowd waited, no throne stood, but beneath his feet, the stones warmed. They had remembered his steps, from long ago, and not long at all. He walked into the grove, once palace, once barracks, once ruin, now just trees in its center. A stone, uncarved, weathered. He sat beside it. Not to speak, but to wait. Not to command, but to finish, above him. Clouds parted for the last time. The stars appeared. One blinked, then went out in Vienna. A violin broke its string on a silent note. In Venice, a candle relit itself in an empty church. In Athens, an old man wrote the same name 3 times, then forgot what it meant. And in Constantinople, still called Istanbul, still breathing names it cannot forget. The city shifted, not in stone, but in soul. A long-held breath had been released, not in words, but in rhythm, and in the quiet of that rhythm, one final truth rang out. The heir had returned, but he had never come to rule, only to remind the world, that nothing sacred is ever truly lost, only waiting to be remembered.